In yesteryear, the oceans were the equivalent of the highways of today, and when the major propulsion method was mostly wind and sail, vessels sailed the tracks which prevailed, irrespective if the road hadn't been maintained that well. These weren't luxury cruises, only the rare person travelled for pleasure. Ocean travel was hard yakka, especially down to the Antipodes, and seasonal affairs. The vessels parked up at New Zealand ports in the mid-1800s weren't disembarking tacky souvenir-gathering tourists, rather almost entirely immigrants glad to finally be on solid ground. Shore travel had an entirely different meaning, sailing the seas being not for the light-hearted and thin on stomach lining. There are documented cases where tormented passengers threw themselves into the ocean rather than endure the passage any longer. This is before you get to deal with the risk of the vessel being sunk. The chief way that would occur was threefold: sailing into inanimate objects like reefs, then we had fire. Before we get to the number one killer, storms and rough seas. Buckle up.
I looked away, I was scared. I stacked it.
Exhaust temperature, outlets. Roller finance, breakdown.
That, by the way, was the New Zealand Navy vessel, the Otago, in the same waters I'm talking to you about today. The odds of a vessel you were on sinking between the United Kingdom and New Zealand at that time were exactly 1 in 100. I somewhat doubt the safety level would be acceptable today. In the decade we are talking about here, 7 vessels would go down travelling between New Zealand and the United Kingdom, the same number on the return journey. 2 of those 14 would disappear altogether. The first of those was the Matoaka, which left Lyttelton bound for London in May 1869 with 77 on board and was never seen again. The Matoaka crops up in New Zealand history books for one mutual reason: importing pests. The first of 3 shipments of birds to make those making a new life in a strange corner of the world feel at home. Cages of sparrows, thrushes and blackbirds breezed through primary industries after docking, then flew merrily into a garden near you. The other, a 2-legged pest that arrived on the passenger manifest, a woman who went close to getting all the pubs closed, horse racing banned, girls prohibited from playing sport, right through to wanting the feeble-minded to be sterilised. It could only be one person: Kate Sheppard. Watch the video that follows and you'll likely refuse the next $10 note you get from the dairy, and you'll certainly change your tune on her. The second vessel to vanish is the main focus of this video: the 960-ton clipper, the Glenmark. The Aberdeen clipper Glenmark made her first voyage between London and Lyttelton in 1865. Okay, technically it's Gravesend if you want to get picky. Lyttelton London was the only route she would sail in the 8.5 passages she made, 7.5 of those with the same captain, Richard Rankmore. For those hard of hearing and easily excitable, that surname is spelt W-R-A-N-K-M-O-R-E. I don't know where I get you lot from. Southbound, the Glenmark's cargo was always the 2-legged kind. And there's a good chance among the Kiwi viewers watching this, someone will put their hands up and say, "My rally came on her." If so, we'd love to know about you or them in the comment section below. On one sailing alone, the Glenmark carried 400 passengers. who would have gone forth and multiplied. In terms of accommodation, that vessel was considered salubrious for the time, the cabin arrangements being broadly much the same as air travel today. The majority opted for the open plan cheap seats. You and I think we have it hard in cattle class for 12 hours. The big selling point for the 200-foot vessel was its speed, on average 95 days, 20% less than the majority of her competitors. At the time, journeys of this length, 3 to 4 months, produced a fair few births as well as deaths, disease spreading like wildfire. The Tamandra on your screen completed a voyage down south in 1842 with a passenger list of 201, 5 children and 1 adult, of which were to die at sea, all by white privilege, which was somewhat balanced by 5 births. Another quirky detail about the Tamandra amongst its provisions were 380 gallons of stout and 48 gallons of rum. Take from this what you will. Immigrants on board the colourfully named Flying Foam in 1864 had a great tale to tell about their journey. When infighting between the crew and passengers boiled over, a rebellious clique of 8 sailors tried to take over the vessel and sail it to a Pacific island a la Fletcher Christensen. The captain armed the passengers and converted some of the second-class cabins into mini prison cells to house them. When they still kept being troublesome, manacles were employed, and when that failed to calm the ringleaders down, the ship's carpenter constructed stocks where they were placed during the entirety of the day. Armed police boarded the vessel upon arrival into Auckland. As I previously mentioned, these certainly weren't cruise ships. The passengers weren't tucking into the buffet at night, rushing to happy hour, or drunkenly dancing the Macarena. Back to the Glenmark, who was about to embark on a return journey at Lyttelton, London on the 1st of February 1872. She wasn't going alone, having the company of the Natal Queen and the Robert Henderson. 5 days south of port, they would all encounter a storm and become separated. It wasn't till belatedly getting into England the Natal Queen and Robert Henderson discovered the Glenmark was missing, never to be found. On board the doomed vessel were 50 souls, a large shipment of wool, and an even more valuable shipment of gold, freshly out of the ground of the west coast of the South Island. It's little wonder today that the Bank of England holds 20% of the world's gold reserves, a fair swagger of that from 19th century fields of Australia, Canada and New Zealand. How much went down with the ship? It's impossible to be exact, in modern terms broadly between 30 and 40 million US dollars. For the record, remember the Matoaka? Well, she sank along with 20 to 30 million in New Zealand bullion. The Blue Jacket lost most of its 20 to 30 million in gold in the fire at the bottom of South America, although some was used, believe it or not, as ballast in the fleeing lifeboats. At some stage I'll do a video on that little number. What makes Glenmark so noteworthy is her haul of gold being the most valuable, which had a large impact on its owners, only because of that 1 in 100 risk of sea travel. The normal maximum you could insure cargo for was 70% or less. It also pays to mention often vessels travelled with clandestine shipments for security reasons. No one knew about the gold on the Matoaka, for example, well, at least not until the vessel was long on the bottom and the owners were forced to lodge a claim, for which transparency's sake popped up in the local newspapers. Unlike the fate of the Matoaka, we have a fairly good idea of the vicinity of where the Glenmark sank. For starters, the testimony of her travel partners, the Natal Queen and Robert Henderson, who were last in contact on the evening of the 6th of February. Then there was the Australian barque Sir Humphrey Davy, spelt 3 ways depending on the publication you read, 17 days out of Sydney, the Sir Humphrey Davy ran into the same storm. Through the maelstrom, her captain spotted wreckage of a vessel on the surface, and that was on the 7th of February. This landlubber, who gets motion sickness having a shower, is about to get well over his head and try and pinpoint where you should charter a vessel to. And this is our starting point. Now we have the rough respective routes on where they were likely to coincide. Finally, your search zone according to moi. Before you go ahead and put a deposit on a multi-million-dollar underwater autonomous vehicle, this ocean floor mat should curb your enthusiasm. If the Glenmark was resting on Campbell Plateau, somewhere under the waves between 500 and 1,000 metres, you may have a sniff. Spot that blue area to the right? Not a shit show. 4 to 5 k's to the bottom. Still keen? Despite massive progress in technology, engineering, etc., in the ensuing century and a half since those vessels sank, now and again we humans living in smug modernity are brought back to stark reality. Oceans are awfully large places to search for something as small as a wooden clipper, or for that matter, a modern jet. Next up, New Zealand's most overrated woman. Hope you stick around for that one. Thanks for popping by today. Bye for now.